When most people think of childhood trauma, they think of something dramatic, something that happened, something visible, something that would make sense to anyone who heard about it. But the most common forms of childhood trauma don't look like that. They don't have a moment you can point to. They don't have a clear story to tell. And because they're invisible, because there's no obvious wound, no single event, no villain, many people who carry them never connect what they experience as adults to what happened in childhood. Or rather, to what didn't happen. Today, we're going to name 5 forms of childhood trauma that psychology recognizes as genuinely damaging, that almost nobody talks about. Before we go into the specific forms, one framing matters above everything else. Trauma is not defined by what happened. It is defined by what the nervous system experienced and how it adapted. This means that experiences which look mild from the outside can leave deep imprints inside, that what a parent dismissed as normal can have been genuinely overwhelming for a child's developing nervous system. And it means that the absence of what was needed, not just the presence of what was harmful, counts. A child who is chronically dismissed is not less affected than a child who was directly harmed. They are differently affected, and their nervous system carries the adaptation just as durably. The first form is one of the most common and the least named. Not abused, not neglected in the obvious sense, just not seen. The child whose inner world was never asked about, whose feelings were never reflected back to them, who could sit in a room full of people and feel completely alone because nobody was curious about what was actually happening inside them. Psychologists call this emotional invisibility, and research on it consistently shows it produces the same core wound as more obvious forms of neglect. The child learns, my inner experience doesn't matter, not through cruelty, through consistent absence. And the adult who grew up as the invisible child often has profound difficulty believing that their feelings, their opinions, or their experience are interesting or important to anyone around them. They move through the world performing competence while genuinely not knowing if the person inside performing it has any value at all. The second form doesn't require conflict. It doesn't require anyone raising their voice. It just requires something always being slightly wrong. The household where the atmosphere was never quite settled, where you could feel that the adults were unhappy with each other, with life, with something unspoken, without anyone ever naming it, where you became an expert in reading the emotional temperature of a room before you were old enough to have words for what you were sensing. Psychologists studying chronic low-grade stress in childhood environments find that sustained ambient tension, even without acute incidents, produces measurably elevated baseline cortisol in children. The nervous system trained on unpredictability develops a specific kind of hypervigilance. It is always ready, always monitoring, always waiting for the thing that might happen. The adult from this household often can't explain why they never feel fully relaxed, even in environments that are genuinely safe. Their nervous system is still reading the room. The third form sounds simple. Its effects are not. You're overreacting. It's not that bad. Stop being so sensitive. These phrases, heard consistently across childhood, teach the child a specific lesson about their own inner experience. It is not reliable. It is excessive. It is a problem. Research by psychologist Kristin Neff on self-compassion consistently shows that adults who struggle most with self-criticism and internal harshness are those whose emotional responses were most consistently minimized in childhood. Because the voice that eventually says you're overreacting, that tight, dismissive inner voice that appears whenever you feel something strongly, isn't originally yours. It's borrowed from someone who found your feelings inconvenient, and now it runs automatically, applied to everything you feel without you even noticing where it came from. The fourth form is perhaps the most widely unrecognized, the child who grew up managing a parent's emotions, not because they were asked to, but because the signals were clear. When a parent was depressed, the child cheered them up. When a parent was anxious, the child smoothed things over. When a parent was angry, the child made themselves smaller and quieter until the danger passed. This is what psychologists formally call parentification, and its effects run deeper than most people realize. The child who is responsible for an adult's emotional state never learned that their own emotions were the priority. They learned to read outward and manage, never to read inward and receive. The adult who grew up this way often becomes highly attuned to everyone around them, aware of moods, responsive to needs, skilled at managing emotional environments, and completely unable to identify, name, or ask for their own. The care they give so naturally to others, they genuinely do not know how to give to themselves. The fifth form surprises people because it looks like love, the child who was never allowed to fail, who was rescued from every difficulty, who was protected from every consequence, whose parents solved every problem before it became hard.
This sounds like good parenting. It is actually a form of harm. Psychologist Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness and its counterpart, mastery experience, shows that children who never develop the experience of facing something difficult and getting through it never build the internal evidence that they can. They arrive in adulthood without having been tested, without the cellular knowledge that they can handle hard things. And when difficulty arrives, and it always does, they face it with a nervous system that has no data about its own resilience. The child who was protected from everything often becomes the adult who is afraid of everything. Not because the world is more dangerous than it is, but because they were never given the chance to learn that they could survive it. These 5 forms of childhood trauma have something in common. None of them require a dramatic event. None of them need a villain. None of them would be recognized as trauma by most people who experience them. And that is exactly what makes them so difficult to address. Because when there is no obvious wound, when there is no story you can tell that clearly explains why you are the way you are, the explanation most people reach for is, something is wrong with me. That conclusion is wrong. The hypervigilance, the self-minimization, the inability to rest, the difficulty receiving care, the fear of failure. These are not character defects. They are intelligent, functional adaptations to environments that required them. The first step isn't therapy. It isn't a program. It isn't a plan. It is naming what happened, accurately, without minimizing, without comparing yourself to people who had it worse. What happened to you happened. It shaped you, and it has a name. The trauma nobody talks about is the hardest to heal, not because it's deeper, but because it's harder to see. You can't grieve something you haven't named. You can't work through something you don't believe counts, but it counts. The invisible child's loneliness counted. The tension in the household that nobody named counted. The feelings that were dismissed counted. The parents' emotions you managed counted. The failures you were never allowed to have counted. All of it counted. And you are allowed, now at whatever stage of life you're reading this, to say so. If this video names something you've been carrying without knowing what to call it, share it with someone who needs to hear it too. And subscribe, because every week we go deeper into the behaviors, the patterns, the things about being human that nobody explains.